Hello, everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today, I want to discuss nuns. Is it okay to objectify them? Now, you might be wondering where all of this is coming from, and like so many of our recent topics, this is courtesy of Twitter.com. It truly is the curse that keeps on giving. You might assume this came up because someone asked about religious roleplay on kinky Twitter, or maybe some inappropriate AI art went viral, but no, that actually wasn't it at all. Instead, what happened is a user tweeted a drawing of a nun with the caption, quote, "Don't care how much religious trauma you got, stop sexualizing nuns, parentheses, I'm serious," which, naturally, a lot of people had opinions about. After all, anytime you tell someone they have to stop doing something online, they will probably fight you about it. And I guess that means I'm also fighting about this because as a kinky person, getting to objectify nuns or not is like kind of part of a lot of people's wheelhouses. Now, I have to admit, as someone who was raised Catholic, I don't really care too much about how other people portray nuns or if they get off to them or not. I realize that most modern depictions of typical hot nuns and their corresponding Halloween costumes are not actually that accurate. They bear about as much resemblance to real nuns as modern French-made roleplay outfits do to the 19th century uniforms they're based on. It's all pretty abstracted at this point, and basically they exist as separate things in my brain. There's actual nuns as people, and then like nuns as a concept in an erotic context. But it did get me thinking, well, why are so many people so intrigued by outfits like this? Could it actually be wrong to sexualize nuns? And what about other common roles like teachers or priests or maids? Who gets to decide if doing that is wrong or right? And who gets to participate in that sexualization if it is actually permissible? The anti-sexualization stance, as I'll call it, this time around started off with the idea, quote, "Nun characters don't have to be scantily clad to be doing something cool." That was more or less the idea. It's very similar to the anti-chainmail bikini argument that's levied against depictions of fictional women in fantasy games, but applied to nuns. And sure, yeah, if you're making a character with a clear religious affiliation and you want to go for accuracy, maybe don't dress the character up like the anime idea of what a nun is. But personally, I don't really care about games for what I want to talk about today. So what else was going on? Because this argument quickly spread from just being about games to being about fantasies and role plays of all kinds, including the more adult versions like you see in kink. And as it turns out, one of OP's original points, which was stated later on in the thread, was a belief that people were doing this out of a sort of anti-Christian sentiment. Quote, "What I tried to say is that people sexualize nuns because they hate Christianity. Just because Christianity and Catholicism has been the part of colonization and people who practice has done bad things, that doesn't give you pass to sexualize any of them, WTF." And these quotes, as much as I can discern them, give me an idea of what's really going on here. It's almost as though we are treating the sexualization of a role or a job as a concept as being the same as sexualizing a specific person, which, at least in my mind, is typically a whole other ballgame. I can see why someone might not be able to make the distinction, though. In the current internet age, especially on places like Twitter, there is a lot of miscommunication like this. People will hear things like aftercare is important after a BDSM scene, which is a good point, and then somehow translate that into not getting aftercare by default without asking for it is abusive, which is not really what we're going for. Or they hear how sexualizing real people without that person's consent, like maybe sending sexual DMs to a streamer or making deepfakes of them, is wrong, and then they start to apply that logic to fictional characters as well. You know, Dean and Castiel didn't and can't consent to your writing fanfic about them, so reading fanfic about them or writing fanfic about them doing stuff together is wrong. And taken a step further, I've even seen people worry that it's a consent violation to read a steamy scene in a novel or watch one on a television show, either because the fictional characters didn't give consent to our voyeurism as viewers or readers, or because the writers didn't get our consent to put those things in their stories because we might not want to read them. I do think there is a chance that this is all some kind of like 4D chess psyop and no one actually really believes this, but on the outside chance it is a genuine movement, there is something to be said for the childification of the young adult years that seems to be happening. You know, the whole I'm a 24-year-old teenager thing? And I do believe that mentality, insofar as it's real, could be part of why discourses like this are happening more often. You know, I'm basically still a baby, so it's a crime if I accidentally interact with a piece of media that I find distasteful. That's essentially the vibe. But I really don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill and make it seem like a few tweets from really small accounts represent some growing, dangerous movement we have to be aware of, because it's really not that. Maybe one day it will be, at which time we will address it. But treating it just on the level it is now, I still can't help but be a little worried when folks can't seem to distinguish between the consent of real people, literal, specific people, and the consent of fictional characters. I have to imagine that this in some way indicates there's been a breakdown of understanding, either of consent on the whole, or that flesh and blood people who happen to have jobs online are more real than characters in a video game, rather than being equivalent. The emotional intelligence here is concerning, and the confusion has happened enough that it does make me scratch my head and go, okay, what's happening here? Where did we go wrong? How is this confusing? And I think the connection to nun representation here is obvious. In the same way that people have trouble understanding consent as applied to real people versus fictional characters, they also have trouble understanding consent as applied to fantasy concepts or the, quote, sexualization of certain occupations. You know, role play things, or maybe having a kink for a specific kind of uniform. If sexualizing an internet personality is the same thing as sexualizing Sherlock, a BBC character, then why wouldn't a hot nun OC be the same as sexualizing a specific, real-life person? I guess that would be the logical conclusion if that's really how you think about things. And there was actually another response to the original tweet I saw going around, which I think perfectly demonstrates why folks are so touchy about nuns specifically when it comes to all of this. They said, quote, like sexualizing nuns are weird for real, like they swore off sex for life, and now you're sexualizing them. It's like drawing Holocaust survivors as not as extreme, but still, like, wow, oh my god, thank you for the parenthetical at the end. that really cleared things up. And yes, that 4-letter word that starts with N is exactly the word you think it is in this context. Godwin's law strikes again. And so does the modern fascination with purity. I would argue that this would be a problem if anyone was, once again, sexualizing a specific person who happens to be a nun, but I've literally never seen that happen. But why sexualize the role of nuns in general as a concept? Why would that be in any way intriguing? Looking at it from just a sexology perspective and not from a religious or a historical one, we have a few readily available explanations. We know, for example, that taboo is a key fantasy theme for many folks. According to Justin Miller's research, the 4th most common reason for having a fantasy was, quote, to express or fulfill a socially taboo sexual desire. His research has also shown that 87% of men and 72% of women have engaged in fantasies about taboo subjects. Taboo is such a common fantasy theme that it's more popular than passion and romance. And I will say, hearing that folks with a certain bias may interpret that as being evidence that society is becoming more and more degenerate, but I am not so sure that that is the only reason. Referencing another frequently cited author on this channel, Jack Morin, he explains in his work that taboo fantasies often come from attempting to cope with disgust, fear, and other intense feelings. By sublimating the feeling with sexual arousal, it becomes easier to deal with and recontextualizes that feeling in our minds. And knowing that, it's not really a wonder to me that in a society full of sexual shame for basically any kind of sexual thought or feeling, we then see people pop up with taboo fantasies to process all of that shame. Be that with voyeurism, exhibitionism, humiliation kinks, or being turned on by the wrong kind of person, like a celibate nun, or indeed the wrong kind of person being turned on themselves. And what could be more wrong than a person who has sworn off sex for life and intimate pleasure as well, experiencing arousal, being seduced, or even being the seducer themselves? The connection then seems pretty obvious to me. Now, another obvious connection is early life exposure. If you were someone who went to Catholic school or otherwise interacted with nuns at a young age, it would not be outside the realm of possibility that you might have linked them to feelings of arousal. This is a common explanation for fettuccinis. If y'all have watched my channel before, you know what that is a code word for. The classic example goes something like this. So, someone going through the early stages of sexual development will see or interact with something while experiencing feelings of arousal for the first time. Let's say it's a pair of stockings. The pair of stockings becomes associated with feelings of pleasure, which then motivates that person to seek more of that same pleasure out using the pair of stockings, which then strengthens that connection between the two with repeated interactions. And then you repeat that enough times, and bingo, bango, bongo, you've got yourself a whole plate of fettuccine, so to speak. Anyway, if you catch my drift. And if you were someone who was ever punished by or scolded by a nun, a similar process could also easily happen. To deal with the shame or physical pain of that experience, it may be transmuted into an erotically charged memory, or it may be something that you want to recreate in an erotic context. Doubly so if that shame was sexual in nature to begin with. Like maybe you were punished for being caught Googling naughty words during school hours. I mean, honestly, how can we be surprised some people may sexualize nuns in their private fantasies when we've got this many reasons for fantasies about them to exist? And Listen, I have not even gotten into the folks who have broader reasons for fantasizing about churches or priests or nuns or the whole general motif of the Catholic Church. Like folks who maybe weren't directly punished by nuns, but were hurt by their upbringing in the Catholic Church in some way. They would have a pretty good reason to have that sort of connection. Or people who have a cultural history of experiencing harm at the hands of clergy members, as a lot of indigenous folk do. People will therefore naturally sometimes have fantasies about power and corruption involving that church or nuns or priests, and it would not be unheard of. So, all of this is really to say that I think fantasies about nuns or representing nuns in a sexualized fashion as a way of, subverting the typical imagery of the church is both common and easily explained. It's not about violating a real life nun's consent, but about coping with pain, trauma, shame, or simply enjoying a taboo. And the same can easily be said for most roleplay and uniform fantasies, whether they're based on teachers or schoolgirl skirts or nurses or maids or anything like that. It's also important to remember that for many, nuns are about as real in their everyday lives as wizards or historically accurate Victorian housekeepers. They're characters you might see on TV, but they're not people you interact with in your everyday existence. And yet, I'm not seeing anyone get out the pitchforks for folks who have Victorian household-based fantasies, because we realize those fantasies aren't about specific real-life people or even historical figures, at least most of the time, but about the attributes and attitudes we assign to them. Having a fantasy about a Victorian housemaid is not necessarily going to harm a current modern-day real-life maid. Fantasies are not real life, and ideally, it should be a place where we can safely explore thoughts and ideas without judgment. Assuming, of course, those ideas don't translate into permission for real-world harm. And that is the case with certain fantasies. Listen, I'm not a sex therapist, so I'm not really going to get into that conversation, but that is an unstated part of the argument, right? Sexualizing and objectifying people is wrong because it harms them in some way, and it should be against our values to harm people. For this particular case with nuns, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that some random sister in Bolivia is not meaningfully harmed by you drawing a spicy picture featuring the concept of a nun on a website that she will never visit. So that leaves real-world direct harm as a possibility. Now, unsurprisingly, I wasn't able to find any studies about nun-based fantasies leading to violence or permissive attitudes towards violence. So I'm going to guess that this is not a major factor in violence towards nuns. This is not to say that nuns do not experience violence, whether it be from clergy or lay people in the Catholic Church or random men who think ruining a pure, chaste woman is some kind of perfect revenge. I don't doubt that nuns, especially as women, are subject to violence. I just don't see how a random bisexual woman on DeviantArt drawing nuns kissing would contribute to that risk for harm. But forgive me if I'm missing something. Feel free to correct me if there is a flaw in my logic here. I'm just not seeing the connection to real-world harm happening or even permission for it. And I do find it interesting that some folks are defensive towards nuns, specifically because they've taken celibacy pledges. Like that makes it more wrong to fantasize about the idea of a nun compared to a woman in literally any other role. Forgive me again if I'm missing something here, but if we are drawing a parallel between the fantasy version of a job as an abstract concept and specific real-world people who have that job experiencing harm, wouldn't it be just as wrong to fantasize about A bikini model, for example, bikini models do not implicitly consent to being part of a stranger's fantasy life. Their consent should also matter, and they certainly don't consent to being sexualized outside of the very specific frame they present themselves in, which they control and they have a say over. You can't assume they'd be down for literally whatever thing simply because of their job. So it seems to me like we might have some unresolved issues around how we perceive women and value their consent based on if we see them as pure, virginal, or good, even. And you might even be able to argue that, actually, it's sexualizing women to say they should cover up, like nuns do, to avoid being seen as sexual objects, because that implies that women's natural bodies are inherently sexual and open to consumption and objectification at all times if not properly put away. Like an object. But we don't really have time to get into all of that. I'm just saying it could be a conversation that we have, but we don't have time to get into all that because the last big topic I want to get into is the history of sexuality and the church. I don't think you're going to get college credits for this one because this is not a religion seminar, so I'm going to be skipping over a lot here, I am sure, but some of the bigger aspects of this are hard to ignore, and I want an opportunity to highlight them. Like, are we really not going to talk about all of the aggressively horny Renaissance art of Jesus and various saints? I mean, my God, it was basically a free-for-all of abs and brooding dudes. But, Saint Sebastian didn't consent to being drawn like that, so how horrible we're violating the saint's consent in the modern day by gazing upon it, I suppose. But it's not just the saints or paintings either. The medieval Beguines, female members of lay religious orders, frequently described events they experienced in very erotic terms. For example, they relayed their intense emotional experience of Christ by combining the concept of courtly love with lines from the Song of Songs. And if you don't know what that is, because you've never read the Bible, it's what I would call the unrepentantly horny part of the Bible. It's very unique amongst all of the various sections therein, but even describing the Eucharist was an opportunity for ye olde horny posting. I am being quite serious. Throughout the Middle Ages, female mystics in particular described spiritual unification with Christ in explicitly, intentionally carnal terms. The idea, at least in part, was to embrace Christ as a sort of divine healing lover with whom a union would offer spiritual virginity and therefore redemption. Most notably, through the side wound Jesus suffered during his crucifixion, which was often depicted and described in eunuch terms. As one nun put it, and the soul bent herself over the wound and the sweet heart of her only Savior, and drank therefrom deep draughts of all deliciousness and sweetness. Like, come on, people! Whew. No, not you, Jesus. You're not supposed to come. That was not in the script. And I know, we're reading all of this through a very modern lens and all. But the whole point at the time was that such a union with Christ, especially for women, would restore the all-important spiritual virginity, even if the flesh had strayed, as it would have to in a marriage that produced children. Some depictions were even less subtle, though, with prints depicting Jesus literally getting naked in bed with a woman to save her soul. Or at least she was naked. I don't really remember exactly. I'll show it on screen. But there's one more example I really want to talk about. We actually have this story depicted in a 19th century Calderon painting titled Saint Elizabeth of Hungary's Great Act of Renunciation, in which the nude titular character debases herself before God, renounces the world and her children, and vows to follow her naked Lord. I mean, is anyone really wondering at this point why nuns are also called the brides of Christ? At least historically, there is a somewhat literal interpretation of that fact. And the whole point of me bringing all this up is to show that the Catholic Church in particular has been aggressively, deeply horny, often because of its fixation on physical celibacy, and so therefore we should not be shocked when people pick up on these overtones, undertones, tones, themes, the point in general, and then further eroticize those things for less spiritual purposes. Gatekeeping who gets to do this and how is always going to fail because we can't control what other people are thinking. So long as no one is going out there and ruining any real nuns' days, I don't see why we should really be all that fussed about it. In fact, further stigmatizing it, like most taboo interests, seems much more likely to cement it rather than get rid of it. And the same goes for all of the other common uniform and occupation-based fantasies out there, like nurses or firemen. Just, be respectful of actual people. That's the main thing. And that's more or less what I wanted to say in this video. I didn't even get into the connection between Christianity and Catholicism and kink, which is definitely there. So I'll have to save that one for another video. So if you want to make sure you can see that one when it comes out and you want to, even already, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of different subjects. I'd be very curious to know what you all think about this one, especially if you do come from a religious background, if you went through divinity school or something, or maybe you went to Catholic school. I would love to hear all your thoughts and feelings because especially when it comes to religion, I know it's a very touchy subject in kink, especially when you have people that are outside of a religion, maybe using another religion as an aspect of their fantasy landscape. Thank you all so much for watching, and you can leave a thought or comment down below. Again, if you'd like to, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of different kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best you can do that is with Patreon. You can find that and link down below. If you do already support me there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.